nothing but the truth. Hello, this is Raj Chengappa of India Today and your host for Nothing But the Truth. This is my weekly X-ray of key issues that matter to you without holding back on the truth. In this episode, we will deal with a hard question wrapped in even harder choices. With US President Donald Trump announcing that the US would resume testing its nuclear weapons, the big question is whether India should resume nuclear testing too. But first, a bit of a background to this question. The trigger came from a single statement that the US President made, Donald Trump made, which has ricocheted around the world. On October 29, 2025, just minutes before meeting China's President Xi Jinping in Busan, US President Trump said, and he used the social media platform Truth to announce that the United States would start testing our nuclear weapons on an equal basis with other nations. And in the hours and days after, he repeated the point several times, adding that Russia is testing, China is testing, North Korea is testing, and more worrying for India, he claims that Pakistan is testing too. Of course, experts say that there's not many statements that are accurate, and the only thing that is accurate in what Trump said this time was that North Korea has tested nuclear devices in the 21st century. If you recall, Russia, China, and the US have maintained a moratorium on explosive nuclear testing since the 1990s, even while advancing delivery systems that they have. Yet, in nuclear politics, perception is power. And Donald Trump's words, regardless of the technical reality, have injected a dangerous volatility into an already let's put it this way, an already fraying nuclear order. So in this episode, we will try and map the danger of restarting nuclear tests across the world and outline then what are the difficult options that India has. India, remember, has always been a reluctant nuclear power, and now its hand may be forced again. So let's begin by looking at the context. If you see what Trump's nuclear test assertions were about, it came immediately after Russian President Vladimir Putin announced the successful test of two really exotic nuclear delivery systems. One is called Poseidon, which is a nuclear-powered, remember, nuclear-powered. Most of the other missiles just have rocket power, but this has a nuclear, almost like a nuclear reactor inside it, and this powers the missile. And it also is nuclear-tipped and is like an undersea drone designed to travel vast distances, in fact, the entire ocean, and outlast conventional defenses. Experts think that it could even defeat the current US nuclear defenses systems. And that is a very, very important thing, that if the US feels vulnerable from this, and this is this unusual missile that has been tested. Of course, there's a lot of controversy as to whether this would be an effective way of delivery because it is using nuclear power, and therefore the damages, even if it does not strike the kind of radiation problems that it could cause if there was an accident of any kind. Of course, that's true of all nuclear missiles. And added to that, Russia tested another deadly nuclear weapon delivery missile. It's called Bureaucratic. I hope I got the pronunciation right. And it is a nuclear-powered cruise missile, which is theoretically capable of near unlimited range and unpredictable flight paths. So these are two big new missiles that the Russians have announced, and that is the storm that it has created. If you take a look from the political messaging standpoint, the timing was clearly no accident, because Trump seized on Putin's announcements to argue that rivals, the American rivals, were leaping ahead with systems meant to defeat the US missile defenses. Now, even though these Russian demonstrations were not explosive nuclear tests, which is what we normally mean when we say nuclear tests, they are certainly strategic breakthroughs. And by framing them alongside claims that Russia is testing, China is testing, Trump really sought three things to do. And that is why the call to action. The first is to justify the urgency that America must catch up or keep pace. The second was to collapse the distinctions between delivery system trials and warhead detonations in the public mind. We always had that. Delivery systems like Agni, or if you look at Pakistan's missiles or any of the other missiles that were there, these were clearly delivery system ballistic missiles that were there. And if they were tested, they were not seen as nuclear tests as much as if there is a warhead detonation and which causes an explosion. And of course, the third reason was for Trump to create political cover for reviving US explosive testing as proof of strength and reliability, particularly after Russia showed its prowess in this. So in short, Poseidon and Bureaucratic became the rhetorical scaffolding. Their spectacle that they sort of demonstrated or projected was nuclear-powered engines. I told you this is the most unusual form of using nuclear power to power rockets rather than the conventional fuel that rockets use. And of course, the doomsday payloads that nuclear weapons always have, and the capability of missile defense evasion. I mean, these all helped Donald Trump sell the idea that only real nuclear explosions would restore credibility. Now, ironically, the fact is that the US was the one which was the most, in terms of advocating, the ban of testing was among the most vociferous in the 1990s, and it is ironical that a US president is now talking of resuming testing when they, in fact, had introduced the whole issue of trying to ban tests across, particularly during President Clinton's rule in the 1990s. So whether this, the whole business of nuclear tests being technically sound, being debatable, politically, the theater that Trump created worked. Now, internally too in the US, Donald Trump's phrasing sent Washington's national security bureaucracy scrambling. At a Senate hearing that same day that Trump made an announcement, Vice Admiral Richard Correll, the nominee to lead the U.S. Strategic Command, affirmed confidence in the reliability of the U.S. Nuclear arsenal, but wouldn't presume that the president meant live nuclear detonations. Then the U.S. Energy Secretary clarified that what was being contemplated were subcritical experiments, non-critical tests that compress plutonium but do not trigger a self-sustaining chain reaction. In plain English, that meant no nuclear explosion. So Trump's top officials themselves were denying that what the president meant was that these were not explosive tests, but the ones that preceded all of that, and therefore this should be the interpretation. But then Trump, being Trump, in subsequent interviews, he seemed to revert back to the explosive sense of testing, and the whiplash revived a very dominant debate inside the US. And the big question there for them was, should America, after 3 decades of restraint, set off another nuclear blast? And why that matters globally is, well, just let's say a very simple thing. If the US breaks the moratorium on tests, others will follow. The taboo that held since the 1990s would be shattered, and the world would get into an uncertain nuclear arms race that would be very, very dangerous. Now, let's clarify the current position when we talk about nuclear tests. Since the Partial Test Ban Treaty in 1963, and by the way, India had a major role to play in enforcing that with the then Prime Minister Nehru pushing for it, since that time, atmospheric, underwater, and outer space nuclear detonations have been banned, shifting most subsequent tests to underground ones. Now, in 1996, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty sought to ban all nuclear explosions, but unfortunately, it never entered into force. Even so, the norm against explosive testing has endured in all these years. It's almost been 30 years now, and it has still endured. The US and China, by the way, never signed or signed but never ratified the CTBT. Russia ratified and then de-ratified it in 2023, just 2 years ago, after the Ukraine strikes that it did, the Ukraine war. India, Pakistan, and North Korea never joined the CTBT. Now, crucially, the major powers continue to test their delivery system. Remember, delivery, not the weapons, with better missiles, re-entry vehicles, hypersonic gliders, and also conducted what they call subcritical or non-critical experiments. These are largely computer-simulated nuclear tests that are there that do not involve nuclear detonations. Of course, the engineering for nuclear bombs still marches on, but for all these years, the taboo against explosive tests held, and only now that it is being threatened. And that's why Trump's equal basis of what he called, we are going to test on an equal basis line is truly worrying. Because it begins to blur that difference between warhead detonations and delivery system trials. And that blurring is enough to pull the world towards, as I said, a destabilizing nuclear arms race. Let's not forget that there have been roughly over 2,056 nuclear detonations since 1945. Among this, the US has contributed almost half of them. It has conducted 1,030 tests. The Soviet Union or Russia right now 715, France 210, and China 45 plus. The last explosive tests done by these nuclear powers are the US in 1992, Soviet Union before it became Russia in 1990, China in 1996, and so did France. India did its first nuclear test in 1974, and then did 5 subsequent tests in 1998, where it declared itself to be a nuclear weapon state. Pakistan claims to have done 6 tests soon after India did its tests in 1998. The latest to join the test bandwagon is North Korea, which started testing in 2006, and it has also done 6 nuclear tests, with the latest being in 2017. Now, of course, apart from the tests that are done, the nuclear warhead counts continue to be very sobering. They're far less than what it was after both Russia and America, or earlier Soviet Union and the US, entered into treaties to bring down the total number of weapons. Even today, Russia has around 4,300 nuclear warheads, the US around 3,700, and China crossing over 1,000. And if you get any of these, even 5, 10, 20 of these could destroy the world as we know it. But that is the kind of weapons that are already available. Now, if the US resumes explosive testing, Russia has already signaled it will mirror the move. China, with fewer historical test data points than what the so-called Cold War giants had when they began nuclear weapons, has a very strong incentive to validate new designs quickly. That would start putting pressure on India and Pakistan next. And that's how arms races begin, not necessarily with intent, but with insecurity spiraling out of control, where perception outpaces facts, and to restart is to revive all those risks. Now to the central question, should India resume testing? What should India really do? Now, as I had mentioned earlier, India entered the nuclear club very decisively in May 1998 with the Pokhran-2 tests. And remember, the first test, it said, was a peaceful nuclear explosion. But by the second test, which the first test was conducted under Mrs. Indira Gandhi's prime ministership, the second under Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee's tenure, and he declared that India had become a nuclear weapon state, and has since then India has maintained a voluntary moratorium on explosive testing. India never signed the CTBT, which I mentioned earlier, but has acted with tremendous restraint. It is anchored by what it calls a credible minimum deterrence, and it has declared a no first-use posture, which means that it will only use its nuclear weapons if it is attacked by another nation that has nuclear weapons. It will not strike first or use nuclear weapons first in any conflict that's there. And when it says credible minimum deterrence, the idea is to build just the number of weapons that would be enough to deter countries like Pakistan and China, which are our major threats, from trying any sort of nuclear blackmail with us. But if the global taboo collapses, restraint gets harder for India. So there are 3 major pressures that could converge. against India. And the first is the concern of China modernizing arsenal and potentially validating it through new tests. The second, of course, is Pakistan then coupling its own bandwagon to China's strategic trajectory and the likelihood to follow any Indian move. And the third is really perception, is the risk that India's 1998 thermonuclear design or hydrogen bomb design, long debated, remains insufficiently validated against the next-gen defenses and hypersonic carriages. So there are various imperatives for India to look at, which I mentioned, and this could, in some senses, push a decision for India into getting into examining whether it should test or not to. It faces really, if you boil it down into three major broad pathways, if you'd like to call them. One is India stays the course, which is a moratorium plus modernization approach. It reaffirms non-testing. It intensifies computer simulation test, subcritical testing, goes in for a major delivery, modernization of its delivery systems, especially the kind of survivable second strike forces like nuclear submarines equipped with nuclear missile launch capabilities, the triad that we call air, land, and sea capabilities for nuclear strikes, strengthen its command and control so it's able to see what is coming towards it from its adversaries and ability to deliver missiles accurately, harden its infrastructure, and refine its penetration capabilities of penetrating enemy defenses. The upside of this is that India preserves its diplomatic capital, though that doesn't seem to be much the way Trump behaves. It avoids sanctions, particularly Europe and other countries will may impose sanctions if they see that India is also doing it, and then India keeps the moral high ground. The downside, of course, is if rivals test and leap ahead technically, India risks a credibility gap in its nuclear defenses, and that is something it doesn't want. The second option is to go for what is called conditional readiness, which is we have a moratorium now, but will test if triggered, and declare that India will maintain its moratorium unless others conduct explosive nuclear tests, but says that we will retain our option. Simultaneously, India should ramp up its technical readiness at home, improve diagnostics, instrumentation, and data pipelines, so that if India must test, it can do so purposefully, and once validating exactly what doctrine it requires, it can then say, okay, we have done what we done, and we will not do further tests. So this is an opportunity that it can say that we are keeping a moratorium, we do test, we are ready with doing our tests. The upside of this, we have flexibility without preemption, deterrence by ambiguity. The downside is the timing pressure. India must be ready before rivals test data reshape the balance. And that's a very, very important thing. So the third choice for India is for proactive resumption. Just do limited purpose-built tests, announce a narrow, finite test series to validate specific warhead phenomenon. If you recall, there was a huge controversy when, in 1998, that India's boosted fission margin devices, as well as the fusion stage, the hydrogen bomb stage performance and miniaturization for various multiple entry vehicles need to be validated far more than just in one test. In fact, there was a huge controversy over the hydrogen bomb, with some of the senior Indian scientists claiming that it was a fizzle, the others denying it. India gets an opportunity. It can end all those ambiguities that existed in terms of its arsenal, particularly the more powerful hydrogen bomb. It does have atomic bombs. It does have the other kinds of boosted fission weapons that is there. Those also need to be validated. And of course, it starts looking at delivery systems, more powerful delivery systems. The upside is all these debates, technical debates about its readiness and deterrent credibility will die down. The downside is there's near certain regional cascade, international headwinds and protests, environmental costs, of course, huge budgetary costs in terms of the arms race, something that India does not need. So finally, let's look at when testing its nuclear weapons would make sense for India. I told you there are three options it has, and if supposing we move towards testing it should, as we've mentioned earlier, should never be a reflex action. This is too serious a decision. It should be a threshold decision triggered by concrete conditions. There are four red lines that we could think about. One is if there's an adversary who does explosive testing, if the US, Russia, especially China, conducts live detonations to validate new warhead classes, the CTBT norm will effectively be destroyed or dies. It never was enforced in any case, but that will just put the last nail into the coffin. India must then judge whether Sting, abstinent, imposes unacceptable risks to the country. Second, it must look at its demonstrated technical gaps. If our enemies or rivals field variable yield, miniaturized or penetration optimized warheads, whose performance cannot be matched by India's simulation confidence, a test may be necessary to restore assurance, both internally and in adversaries' minds. Then, of course, let's look at the defense breakthroughs, as we saw in what Russia did. And if these are hypersonic, underwater, whatever combinations that threaten to neutralize our existing arsenal, then we need to tailor our warheads to defeat those systems, and this could be justified. Of course, there is the geopolitical environment. If it deteriorates and any perception of India's hesitancy invites coercion, a limited data-rich test could reset the narrative, and this provides a broader kind of look at the modernization plan that we can do. In every case, in this, it's very important that the test must be narrow, instrumented, and strategically integrated, not a chest-thumping exercise. And that's why we're looking at the fact that in the months ahead, every expert that I spoke to should look at these things that I'd mentioned earlier, reaffirm a conditional moratorium, and assert that India remains committed to a non-testing but reserves the right to revisit if any state resumes explosive nuclear testing. The idea is to say that, look, we are not wanting tests, and unless we are compelled to do so, we believe that the world should work towards reducing the number of nuclear weapons it has, and in fact go in for a total ban of nuclear weapons whenever possible. So that's the Indian stand that has always been, that we are reluctant nuclear powers, and we preferably will not want nuclear weapons to come into action, given the devastation it could cause to human life, apart from destroying the Earth's atmosphere and all the other health effects that it has. Of course, we must harden our second strike, because that now might seem important, particularly maintaining our triad of weapons, including the submarine-developed and launched nuclear missiles that we have. Chance to also upgrade our lab ecosystems, more high-fidelity simulations, our computerized. It's all very, very technical stuff that is there, and real cutting edge of technology which India could use this to do so. So this also presents a kind of an opportunity for India to look at its own weapon systems, nuclear weapon deterrence that it has, and see where it needs to upgrade. At the same time, reassert the moral ground that we have, that we really don't want to get into this nuclear race. I spoke to a very senior scientist, nuclear scientist, who was involved deeply with this thing, a former former scientist, not a scientist, but a former nuclear expert who had actually helped build the bomb. And he didn't want his name mentioned, but he said, the real worry is that this is not something that should be bandied around like this. Scientists themselves are against building more nuclear weapons, haven't given India the deterrence capability. They don't want a nuclear race that is happening, because if India tests, certainly Pakistan will test, and the deeper problem for us is China, because that's our real big threat. So if, for instance, China enters a new testing cycle, then the South Asia's testing domino, as we call it, becomes a matter of when, not if. So there is a lot of sort of background to our decision-making process. We shouldn't just rush into a test. We should watch. Our calculus should be China-centric, stay ahead of the capability plus perception curve, particularly towards China, while absorbing Pakistan's moves as predictable secondary effects. Ideally, we shouldn't be going down the road, because if it does, a nuclear Armageddon stares at us. That is not a comforting thought, and we hope that better sense will prevail and that what Donald Trump said was not explosive nuclear testing, and sooner or later his strategic experts will tell him, hey, cool it, the world doesn't need to be further destabilized. It already is. Thank you for being with me in this episode of Nothing But the Truth. I look forward to having you with me next week. Nothing but the truth.